speaking of the New York Times, you had a great thread about the way the New York Times is reporting on what's happening with Bukele and El Salvador and Trump. So you write, thread, this is one of the more remarkable stories I have seen in my time studying state violence and working on law. But it's also an exercise in propaganda, and it's unbelievable how terrible the U.S. media coverage is. One thing in particular is important to see.
The headline is Bukele proposes deal that would free deported Venezuelans. And then the whole article is about this really bizarre turn of events where the president of El Salvador is now offering to exchange all of the deported. And I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to use air quotes for now because I think it's completely absurd for the New York Times to be calling this a deportation. It's a kidnapping and human trafficking that doesn't follow any settled principles of deportation law or any other law. But he's now offering to trade them for lists of people that the far right is concocting that they want freed in Venezuela. Not only have we been fed this idea that crime is soaring, and one of the great scandals of our time is that MSNBC, CBS, ABC, CNN, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, all these kind of mainstream news outlets that are not the New York Post and not Fox News have created a situation where people across this country feel that crime has been rising and that crime is at, historic highs, when in fact it is at historic lows. That is an incredible achievement of propaganda. I just want to pause on that for a second. Related to that, there is an incredible and really devastating connection in public polling and in people's minds. The idea is that somehow immigrants commit a lot of crime.
Right.
When immigrants commit crime at lower rates than U.S. citizens. And none of the major, supposed crime waves in this country are driven by immigration or immigrants. I mean, it's just a total fabrication. It's like climate science denial. And the mainstream news has completely and utterly adopted and accepted this assumption in much of its coverage by what it chooses to cover, the volume that it chooses to cover it at, the words that it uses, a wave of migrants and a surge of migrants and reporting all these individual crimes by migrants, right? The San Francisco Chronicle had this hilarious, I think, it's important to laugh at some of this stuff because it's just so absurd.
And you give great awards to people, yeah.
Yeah. I give little awards to journalists in the book. I mean, the Chronicle has this absurd line of stories about global immigrant rings of burglars and thieves and stuff with no evidence. Like somebody who rented a car in one of the cities was from Chile. That's not to say that there isn't crime and that nobody who is not a U.S. citizen never commits a crime or anything like that. But it's the idea that there's these trends and patterns from which we should make these consequential policy decisions. And it leads to this idea that we are socialized in, that we need to do these mass deportations and there's this invasion of the United States. So all of these concepts are actually coming from the mainstream news too.
Right. So then you have actually the left, and this is an important distinction. I actually want to start doing this as a game on the show, which is ignorant or dishonest, lying or duped, because you do distinguish between people who are in good faith consuming news and really think it's the truth, and then people who are cynically basically misrepresenting it. So you have people on the left who either cynically or ignorantly, they're adopting right-wing framing, but they don't think that they are. So they're like, look, we may not care about the border, but it's just a real issue that we can't win elections unless we go to the right on the border. Or we may not be that concerned with crime, but we got to shift right to win the elections.
There are some people like that. And I think there are a lot of what I would call more ordinary people who've been brainwashed into thinking that. I don't think there's any evidence to support that. First of all, I show in the book how it's actually totally false when you actually look at elections and what people are running on. And also it creates a world where if you somehow win that election, you're unable to do a lot of the progressive things you want to do.
Of course.
And it fundamentally alters the fabric of our social landscape. I think that most of the elite people that I am in circles with, because I'm a civil rights lawyer running a large nonprofit organization, I deal a lot with politicians, with leaders within the punishment bureaucracy, with corporate people, with foundations and philanthropists, with a lot of journalists. Like many of the elite people I interact with are not doing this in good faith. Like the leadership of the Democratic Party, the high-ranking people at the New York Times. I think that people like Herman Lopez and David Leonhardt at the New York Times are like very much not good faith actors, or Anna Kasparian of Young Turks. These are people who like have been presented with and know like the actual evidence and have various incentives and personal and professional connections and relationships that lead them to, in my view, kind of intentionally try to shape and misrepresent this kind of stuff. And I think there are a lot of amazing journalists. I mean, the whole book that I wrote is actually based on the incredible work of hundreds of journalists who would, even from the New York Times or NBC or ABC or CNN, people who would send me stories and say, hey, my colleague just wrote this story. Could you comment on it? I want to share it in our Slack exchange. Or what do you think about this? Like, it seems wrong to me, So like, there are many people within these institutions that get it, or that are at least skeptical. But I think at a lot of the higher levels, these decisions are being made in a way that is at least knowingly misleading. But I don't think that's the most important aspect of all this. Like the fact of the matter is it's really important that all of us develop more critical comprehension skills and that we come together, like the Bukele story you just put up. That to me is sort of like where this is all going. We are creating a society where we are kidnapping people off the street and essentially selling them to foreign countries with no due process of law whatsoever. And then it's not like they're being, and this is why I think it's so outlandish for the New York Times to call it a deportation. There weren't deportation proceedings.
Right.
And when you deport somebody to another country, you deport them to live somewhere else. You don't deport them to an indefinite prison camp where they could spend decades, with no hope of getting out, or be traded to some other country. I mean, it makes no sense. And if the U.S. government can, with no legal proceedings, just take anybody it wants, and now the Trump administration is talking about doing this to naturalized citizens or even citizens who've been convicted of crimes, just like all of these Venezuelans are supposed to be like convicted criminals at first, right? Which is not true. It can do it to anybody. And their official position is that once they send you across the border, even US citizens have no recourse. There's no court that can release you. There's nothing that can be done. If this is allowed to stand, this is the most consequential moment in US constitutional history in modern times. And the New York Times article about it is portraying this as some kind of feud between El Salvador and Venezuela. And it's like not providing any of the context about the illegal kidnappings, about the courts that tried to stop it by grounding the planes, the defiance of the Trump administration to the Supreme Court order, all of the stuff that is essential for understanding this constitutional crisis. The Times is just ignoring it, and portraying it as like, oh, the El Salvador leader is saying the Venezuelan government is authoritarian and should release these political prisoners, and the Venezuelan government is saying the U.S. government shouldn't have done this to these people and send them to El Salvador. And it's like this, oh, well, who's right? These two foreign kind of cartoonish leaders are feuding with each other, whereas like the real story and the frame. So basically my point is the framing of the Times article is totally normalizing some of the most shocking and serious threats to our collective well-being in modern history.
And illegal, right? I mean, they're also they're talking about things that are very illegal as if they are part of immigration due process.
I mean, the Supreme Court has already said that even under the Trump administration's invocation of this Alien and Enemies Act, which is going to be litigated in court, and like it seems pretty clear that like you can't invoke that act in these circumstances. Even under that, though, people would be entitled to some process. There's no even colorable argument that anything that's happening here is legal. And that is just totally lost in the New York Times coverage.